Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews. Today we're beginning to look at Hebrews chapter 4. We're going to read verses 1 through 3 to get us started. Now you recall as chapter 3 ended, the author of Hebrews had given a warning to believers, a warning that came from the Old Testament. He reminded his readers that the Israelites who experienced the deliverance from Egypt, they experienced the Exodus, yet that original generation never entered the promised land. Even though they had seen the power of God in bringing them out of Egypt, even though they had seen the Red Sea open and they went through and were delivered, yet they wavered in their belief in the wilderness. They tested God. And when it came to entering the promised land, they believed the word of the 10 spies who said, we can't take the land, the people are too powerful. They doubted God's ability to bring them into the promised land. And so God said to that original generation, you'll spend 40 years in the wilderness. All of you will die. Your children will inherit the promised land, but you will not enter. And he called that the rest. He said, you will not enter the rest of the promised land. All right, now as he starts chapter 4, he's going to continue to talk about entering the rest. He's going to use what happened to that original generation of Israel as an analogy of believers who have experienced salvation but have not entered the rest of God. All right, let's see what he says. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest. Just as God has said, so I declared in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. So there's something about entering into the rest of God. Now, as we saw in the Old Testament, that was the promised land, the land of abundance, the land that flows with milk and honey. But the author of Hebrews is using this as an analogy. Obviously, Christian believers are not going to possess the land of Canaan. Christian believers are not going to enter physically the promised land. That was the Old Testament promise. But it's an analogy to the promise in the New Testament. Now remember, the promised land represents the land of abundance, a land that flows with milk and honey, when you will live the full life that God has for you. So in comparison that to Christian believers, I think the author of Hebrews is saying, when you've experienced deliverance from sin, you are now to enter into the full and abundant life that God has for you. You are to live fully in his grace, fully in his salvation, walking by faith, following Jesus, listening to his voice. Your life is abundant. You remember in the Gospels, Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and that you might have it in abundance. That abundant life, that full life in Jesus, is the promised land for the believer. That is the land of rest. Now, the Israelites did not enter their rest. And the author of Hebrews says, be careful that you as followers of Jesus make the same mistake. I think basically what that means is this. There are a number of Christians who experience salvation. They've been saved by grace through faith, and yet they never live the abundant life that Christ has for them. They live defeated lives. They live lives with a lack of faith. They can't seem to go on to the victory of the full life Jesus has for them. They're filled with anxiety and filled with worry and despair sometimes. And they live defeated lives. Even though they're in Christ, they're living as though they're defeated, always wandering in the wilderness, never entered into that promised land of the full life that God has for his people, what he calls the rest I have. He says, now, it's still there, but don't make the mistake like they did of falling short of it. The Christian life is not meant to be a defeated life. The Christian life is not meant to be a life filled with anxiety and worries, as though we can't believe God will keep providing for us. No, we're meant to live fully and victoriously We're meant to enter into the promised land of the abundance that Christ has for us. So the author of Hebrews says, be warned by the original generation of Israelites. They experienced deliverance, but they did not enter the promised land because they failed to believe or to keep believing. So as Christians, we've been delivered from sin. We've been set free. But now, don't fall short. Don't wander in the wilderness, not believing God can keep providing for you. No. Let's enter into the promised land of the full abundance. That is the rest that God has for his children even today. We'll talk some more about this tomorrow, because as we go through chapter 4, he's going to give us some more details. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews.